Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed us, 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love it too if you shared the show within your orbit. All right, as for this episode, we turn our attention to Australia, where since the October 7th attack, there's been an absolute eruption of Jew hatred and anti-Israel activities. And to brief us on the situation down under, we're joined by Alex Ryvchin. This is Alex's fourth visit to IsraelCast, so if you're a regular listener, you may remember that he is the co-chief executive officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Alex is the author of internationally acclaimed books on history and politics, like Zionism, The Concise History, The Anti-Israel Agenda, and The Seven Deadly Myths, Anti-Semitism from the Time of Christ to Kanye West. And for good measure, he also authored a best-selling children's book. Plus, Alex writes for leading publications and speaks, debates, and teaches around the world and is a regular TV and radio commentator. And with that, Alex joins us now on the line via Zoom from his Sydney home. Alex, it's so great to see you, yet I'm sorry, truly, that it's under these circumstances.
Thank you, Stephen. Firstly, it's so great to be back, and I'm privileged, to be speaking with you again. And I want to say thank you to everyone at JNF. As you said in the intro, they do so much for the people of Israel, and never has it been more vital to support the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and to develop that bond between Jews in the diaspora and Jews in the land. So I want to thank everyone at JNF for the wonderful work they do.
And we want to thank you for all the work that you're doing in the diaspora and Australia in particular, really to strengthen the Jewish community there. Well, listen, Alex, to set the stage, since we have listeners from all over the world, all walks of life, who may not be familiar with the situation in Australia, who may not be following what's been going on, do highlight, if you would, really the attacks the Jewish community has faced since October 7th.
Well, Stephen, it's a long and sordid tale, and it's something that's developing literally day by day. So in the last 24 hours, there have been some developments which I'll talk about. But basically, in the immediate aftermath of October 7, even as the events were still unfolding and news was breaking about, the scale of the barbarity and what had transpired, we saw scenes in my city of Sydney here, about 30 minutes from where I'm sitting now talking to you, where an Islamic cleric stood on the streets and a mob gathered in front of him, and he praised the attacks as a day of pride and a day of joy. He was saying how happy he is, and the mob chanted back, Allahu Akbar. You then had convoys of cars driving through those neighborhoods releasing fireworks. This was a day of great celebration for some people here in Australia. Similar to when we look at the horrific footage of the October 7 atrocities themselves, one thing that stands out is the sheer elation and joy with which these people destroyed whole communities, human life in the most barbaric ways possible. And that same relish, that same joy was exhibited on the streets of Sydney, Australia, thousands of miles away. The following night, there were scenes at the steps of the Opera House, the Sydney Opera House, which is perhaps our most iconic landmark known abroad. And again, a mob of several dozen men in masks gathered there to burn Israeli flags and to chant things like F the Jews, where's the Jews? There was no attempt to even veil their hatred in language about Zionism in Israel. And since that time, we've had a very long and difficult period where things are changing day by day, and it's affecting every aspect of Jewish life in this country. There was a mass doxing of Jewish creatives, mainly artists and actors, where about 600 people had their details shared online, which led to a lot of death threats, led to people losing their work, ostracized from their social networks and from their professions, particularly those involved in the creative spaces. And then several months ago, we had a real kind of watershed moment where a synagogue in Melbourne, known as the Adass Israel Synagogue, which was built by Holocaust survivors, was torched, virtually completely incinerated from within. And then subsequent to that, we had a spate of these fire bombings, including one targeting my former home, where the facade of the house was daubed with red paint, cars in the driveway were set alight and daubed with F Israel and F the Jews. There was a period there where we were waking up every day literally not knowing what's about to hit us, but knowing that bad things are going to happen. And more often than not, bad things were happening. At the lower end, you were having cars torched and daubed with slogans. At the higher end, you had this deliberate targeting of individuals, prominent individuals, attacks on childcare centers. And you can imagine the sense of, panic and terror that this would unleash in the Jewish community, where people were having conversations about, is it safe to send our children to school? Is it safe to identify as Jewish anymore? It's been a difficult period, but there's a sunny side to these things as well, as we often see in Jewish history, where periods of great trauma and great stress lead to greater unity in the Jewish people and a surge in pride and a desire to identify and to seek the company of our own. And so I've never felt a greater kinship to my fellow Jew. I've never felt a greater, a palpable display of Jewish pride and determination. We've never been more together as a community. And it's a beautiful thing, but it's also terrifying, the circumstance in which it's had to emerge. And, I alluded to at the beginning of my response about the developments in the last 24 hours. We've been informed by the police that some of these fire bombings, and there was also discovery of a caravan packed with explosives with a note inside listing prominent Jewish targets. And we're learning that following police investigation, they think it's linked not to any anti-Semitic ideology or movement per se, but organized crime involving potential foreign actors, paying activists or paying operatives, criminal operatives here in Australia to target Jewish sites. And that's just added a whole dose of, uncertainty and concern for the Jewish community. The fact that in addition to kind of conventional anti-Semitic actors, you've now got organized crime figures targeting the Jewish community for some unknown criminal purposes.
There's an awful lot to unpack there, Alex. And the first question that I wanted to ask you is who's behind all of this? And you just started to articulate that the police and the authorities are realizing that foreign actors are engaged in all of this. And so I'm just wondering, just kind of also taking a step back, did you see on October 6th, okay, any sort of inclination or any warning signals that something like this could even possibly happen?
Not of this scale and not of this
Mm.
severity, but anti-Semitism, as we well understand, lies embedded in societies. It's something that's steeped in the consciousness, and the main movements that were responsible for anti-Semitism, they didn't suddenly awake on October 7th. They were always there, and for several years, we were concerned by neo-Nazi activity and organizing in this country. They really capitalized on people being shut in during the pandemic, on conspiracy theories around, COVID and the Jews as poisoners and trying to take people's rights away during the lockdowns. So that there was a certain surge in that movement, which was discernible. There have always been, hardened Islamist components in Australian society. During the kind of high point of ISIS about 10 to 12 years ago, about 200 Australians traveled to Iraq and Syria to fight with ISIS. And of course, there's a far left movement in this country as well, which normally displays itself in the form of street rallies, university campuses, again, the cultural space and the arts. So the elements were there for a long time, and we were warning the public about it. But did we think that this would explode to the level that it has, and to bring in so many disparate, disconnected components and ideologies, all now focused on menacing and terrorizing the Jewish community? No, it's not something which we expected.
Does Australia have any laws against hate speech, like for that cleric, for example? Because I know in the United States, I believe that clergy is not allowed to talk politics.
There are laws, both civil and criminal, but it seems that in all of these cases, the culprits fall between the cracks and they somehow fall between all of the legal provisions that we as a community have and the police and the state has at its disposal. So there are criminal laws against incitement to violence on the basis of ethnicity or other protected characteristic. But it was held that these sorts of sermons and calls, and there was a sequence of them. It wasn't just that one event. There was a period when clerics were very publicly, glorifying the Hamas attacks and calling on their brethren in Australia to emulate them and referring to Jews as pigs and monkeys and the usual diatribes we're familiar with. But again, it was found that one of the key components of incitement, as in actively trying to procure people to carry out these acts, was missing. There are civil provisions which we've actually used, and we're now bringing several of these clerics to court. And it's a provision which deals with almost, it's like collective defamation, defaming a group of people, but it's a civil law. So the sanctions aren't so punitive and severe, but it's a deterrent nonetheless, and it's a remedy that we have at our disposal and that we're using. But so far, there's been very little justice in terms of all the things we're seeing. Open support for terrorism, which is a criminal offense in this country. People have been on the streets holding up posters of Sinwar, Nasrallah, waving the banners of these terrorist organizations, and very little action has been taken. I think that there was a lateness in terms of the federal government's acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. I think at certain points, law enforcement, despite good intentions, failed to act and again appreciate the severity of the moment. And as we know, when you're dealing with fanatics, they go as far as they're allowed to go. And the failure to contain them early on, I think, has led to this, almost uncontrollable situation.
Alex, I'm trying to understand who are the actual, as I like to call them, useful idiots that are out on the street doing all of the protesting. Those that were at the Sydney Opera House on October 9th, those that are taking to the streets, are they from the Middle East or are they a combination of those from the Middle East as well as white Australians?
Look, there's a mix. And if you look at the composition of the street rallies, there's a mix predominantly of Australians of Middle Eastern descent and Australians, native-born Australians, if you will, who subscribe to far-left ideology. It's that usual kind of mix. In terms of those involved in the scenes at the Opera House, these appear to be Middle Eastern men, young Middle Eastern men. But look, it's coming from all quarters at the moment. And again, this new element of organized crime, there's talk about outlaw bikie gangs, and whether they have a distinct ideology or whether they're trying to cash in and menace and capitalize on a very kind of toxic situation and a very fragile situation, it's not clear. I mean, the operating theory from the police at the moment is that this was done in a coordinated fashion, not to advance the ideology of anti-Semitism, but to distract from their own legal problems and criminal enterprise, to use it as bargaining chips for some grand purpose. Again, this is all still taking shape in as we're speaking now, but there are so many elements to this. And the police early on spoke about foreign coordination being a possibility. There was talk about disinformation from China or Russia to try to destabilize society. Iran is obviously a suspect always with these cases. There are a lot of things at play and not a lot of answers.
Yeah, so we'll have to have you back. This is really breaking as we're speaking right
Yeah.
now. We're recording this the evening of March 10th for me, and it's the morning of March 11th, Tuesday, March 11th. And if all goes to plan, this will be released on March 12th here in the United States. You know, what's so interesting, and perhaps I'm naive, Alex, I've been to Australia, I've been to Sydney. We have this perception of Australia being just this wonderful, laid back land where people have come from all over the world and they've just embraced the beach life and everything's very easygoing and so on. And it just sounds to me like, just in this conversation, and certainly what I've read and heard before we started talking, that once you scratch at that veneer, there's a society there that is really, really disturbed.
I mean, the way you characterize Sydney in Australia, I would still say is overwhelmingly accurate. And I'm an Australian patriot. I adore this country and its people. I've lived here virtually my whole life. And for the most part, Australians have no interest at all in targeting other Australians because they don't like their religious perspectives or their political ideology. They have no interest in importing foreign conflicts and grievances. They want to live their lives in a beautiful country, in peace and prosperity, and have their children grow up freely. These are the things that Australians treasure and value. So it's not a kind of mass movement. There are small segments of society that obviously harbor hostility and harbor hatred. And again, when all is well in a society, that rarely finds expression. It may be something which is spoken about around the dinner table or in the recesses of social media or whatever, but it doesn't really bubble to the surface, and it's not really expressed in a public, you know, extended sort of way. But the war in the Middle East created a forum. It created a situation where there was daily, and there still is, daily focus on the Australian Jewish community, on Israel. And that then created a situation where people felt entitled and able to express hatred, which they clearly long felt. It didn't begin on October 7th. But, you know, at the same time, there's still a positive side to it. And I receive messages all the time in the streets and online from ordinary Australians who stand with the Jewish community, who abhor what's happening. So I think that the overwhelming majority is still very much with us. But as we've seen throughout our history, it doesn't take a majority to change the composition and nature of a society. It takes a sinister, determined minority. And with the right kind of political, social configuration, they can spread their movement and do immense harm. And we see movements begin as something very fringe with limited support, but in time they grow and grow and grow. And there's a concern now that with anti-Semitism being such a hyper-focused issue, it's never been like this in Australia. Anti-Semitism has never been front page news. But for the last 16 months, it's been front page news and leading story on every news bulletin, one form or another. And I think that's, on the one hand, it's made Australians sit up and take notice. On the other hand, I think it's very, very dangerous and very volatile. We don't know where things are going to go.
What has to change then to change people's minds, those that are Jew hating and those that do hate Israel? Like, is it just education, or what is it, Alex? And
I
how
think
can
there's
that,
a,
and how can the change be affected?
I think there's a combination of immediate measures that have to be put in place, and then the long-term rehabilitation of society and strengthening of society to make it resilient in the face of anti-Semitic movement and manipulation. But in the immediate term, it's a matter of national security. It's a matter of policing, law enforcement, judiciary. They have a key role to play in enforcing the law against people who carry out anti-Semitic firebombings and attacks, those who openly support terrorism, those who create encampments on university grounds, on public lands, which make it impossible for Jewish students to operate freely in their own campus environment. I mean, the fact that that's been allowed to flourish here in this country is a scandal. So there are immediate things which must change and must be done. But longer term, of course, education is the key. And I think that one of the fundamental problems we have as a people is that people don't really know who we are. They don't have a clear narrative in their minds about who are these Jews. And I think the majority of Australians will not know that Jews have been in the country since the very first day of European settlement. There were 8, some say 14 convicts that arrived on the very first fleet of convict ships from England. We've contributed to every aspect of life in this country. We're true Australians and we adore this place. But again, I don't think most Australians know that. I think they have a very narrow view of what we are. And in that void of truth, of actual knowledge of who Jews are, you have these negative actors who then fill their minds with an alternate reality. You want to know who the Jews are? Well, Jews are bloodthirsty and they're scheming and they're all powerful. Everything that, you know, my book about the 7 deadly myths
Yeah.
talks about, that's what's being implanted in people's minds right now. And of course, it's not merely local, it's global. I mean, Kanye West is back in a real way.
Yeah.
People like Andrew Tate and Candace Owens and so many people with mass audiences and mass platforms are indoctrinating new people and telling them what the Jews are, which is completely at odds with the reality of who you and I and our people really are.
Yeah, you just alluded to the fact that Jews have made such historical and positive contributions to Australia. I'd like you to tick off just a few of the individuals that have played a role in Australian history.
There's so many. I mean,
Hmm.
among those early convicts was a woman called Esther Abrahams, who was one of the kind of early philanthropists, but also, kind of builders and developers of Australian society. We've had people like Sir John Monash, who is the most decorated and revered soldier in Australian history, the first Australian-born Governor General, so that this is the Queen's representative in Australia, is Sir Isaac Isaacs, a Jew. So many of the great contributors to the arts in this country, to the business community, to the judiciary, to all aspects of life, the sports realm as well. I mean, we are a community that everywhere we go, we do our best to integrate and to give of ourselves to wider society. It's that old, you know, requirement is imposed by Jeremiah to the exiles, where he said, seek the welfare of the land to which I've sent you into exile, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. That's something we've always lived by.
Yeah.
If we contribute to the country that we live in, then we'll benefit from it as well. That's always been our philosophy and our way. And I think most people who have had dealings with the Jewish community in this country view us as a peaceful, productive, patriotic community. But the problem is that in a country of 25 million people, there's about 100,000 Jews. So most people will never have had the benefit of interacting with a Jewish Australian. And therefore, again, it allows people to fill their minds and their social media feeds with propaganda and lies about what we supposedly are and how we think and how we behave. And that's a very dangerous thing and a very difficult thing to kind of overcome.
And Australia has the highest number of Holocaust survivors per capita outside of Israel. And while I would imagine that very sadly their numbers are dwindling, I can't imagine their reaction to what they're seeing out on the streets.
Yeah, look, it's very true, Stephen. I've spoken to a number of survivors who have seen the highest of evils and survived. And they're appalled and shocked by what's happening in Australia, utterly appalled.
Mhm.
They're people who came here with nothing, rebuilt their lives, and found a tolerant, accommodating society in which to do so. And they don't recognize it anymore. They feel like it's changing. I've spoken to the children of survivors who say they feel this kind of relief that their parents aren't alive to see what Australia is becoming. I've spoken to philanthropists, extremely high profile, prominent philanthropists who again say they've contributed to the arts, to business, to science and the medical system in this country. And the country has changed before their eyes. It's fundamentally different. I spoke about incidents that have occurred. There was another incident which probably caught your attention and went all around the world about 2, 3 weeks ago now, where two nurses from a public
Yeah.
hospital were on a social media chat with an Israeli and spoke about wishing him the most painful death, about how they've had Israeli patients through the hospital in the past and how they've killed them, which was probably nonsense. But the fact that they would speak in these terms, the fact that public health professionals would talk about killing people based on their ethnicity. Um, People are just like walking around in a state of utter confusion that this is what this country has become.
Yeah. And I want to go back to what you shared at the top of the program about your home, your former home, being attacked. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you learned about it and actually what happened, and also take us back to the connection that you had with buying the home and your grandfather. I know
Yeah.
it's a
So
bit of a tall order. I read the
no,
article by
I'll
I
take you
read the
there.
article, by the way, in the Wall Street Journal for our listeners.
Yeah.
Alex was featured in a Wall Street Journal article back in February, and I'm going to call up the date here right now. I think it was February. Oh, here it is, February 6, 2025. You were featured up in the article, Anti-Semitic Attacks Mar Australia's Legacy is a Haven for Jews.
So, I mean, the whole thing is still, again, difficult to truly grasp and
Mm,
comprehend and get my head around. And I don't think I've fully processed it because the last 16 months have been a frenzy of nonstop work, and dealing with enormous issues.
mhm.
And it's been the highest of privileges, I can tell you, defending the community and
Yeah,
speaking for them in this time. But it's sometimes hard to kind of process everything that's happening. So my family finally were able to schedule a holiday. We went to Brisbane, stayed in a lovely hotel with the kids, And I ended up working most of that week. It was that when we landed, there was an attack, an arson attack on a synagogue, and I was doing a lot of media. Then the news of the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel broke, and I was doing press conferences. So it was kind of nonstop. And then we landed back in Sydney at the end of that holiday. And then the following morning, my wife and I were woken about 4 or 5 in the morning. Our former neighbors who lived across the street from our old house. So this is our family home where we lived for 5 years. It was a beautiful place that I truly cherished. When we bought it, I thought this would be our forever home. Like it really, it was a sanctuary for us and meant a great deal to us. And the neighbors from across the road had taken footage of just this inferno in front of the house. And then early in the morning, a few hours later, the media inquiries started coming in. And initially, the inquiries were, there's been another anti-Semitic incident. What's your reaction? And I had to say to my media director, hold your horses. This is my old house. And then suddenly the inquiries started coming in one after another. Rumors started to spread that this was my former house, my current house. Can you comment? Can you confirm? Then I'm receiving calls from the Premier, the Prime Minister, counterterrorism police, and it's just a kind of avalanche. And then the news started to break that the former home of a prominent Jewish leader was targeted. So what had happened was you could see in the video footage a car pull up in front of the house in the middle of the night. Two men get out. They have a can of petrol, which they pour like a fuse across the width of the street from one side to the other. In front of the house, there are cars parked in the driveway. They torched the cars. They daubed the cars in the driveway with the racist slogans that I referred to before. They splashed red paint all over the front walls of my former home, and the whole thing went up. And our former next door neighbor in the adjoining property awoke to the sound of explosions. This is a man in his 80s, a Jewish guy who's lived there with his wife for 50 years. He goes outside trying to battle this blaze with his hose. It could have been a catastrophe. It could have been an absolute catastrophe. And so that's what happened. And then finally, I thought there's no point in denying or not answering. So I held a press conference out the front of the house and spoke to the media about what had happened. And then 6 a.m. the next morning, I'm on a flight bound for Poland for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So I was then physically removed from it all. And I was anxious leaving my family behind. My wife and my daughters were very kind of obviously concerned and anxious by the whole situation. But again, that physical distance and throwing myself into work again in Poland and visiting Holocaust sites and all that sort of stuff, I think it prevented me from truly confronting what had happened and what risk was posed to my family. So maybe it's a good thing. I think work is a wonderful thing to recede into when you have things like this to deal with.
Well, especially the work that you're doing. Did they catch the perpetrators?
So again, it's not clear. Some people were arrested in the last kind of couple of weeks as accessories before the fact. So they seem to have conspired with individuals who lit the flame, but weren't the individuals themselves. Now, with the news that I updated you on in the last 24 hours that the police are investigating, there's a suspicion that these master organized criminals were involved in the attack on my former home as well. Some are saying, some news outlets are reporting it quite differently, that wasn't part of their racket of incidents. So it's not really clear. As I said, there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers at the moment.
And did they know? I mean, again, I'm assuming that they knew that you had lived there, or did they think that you lived there? What was their MO, their modus operandi?
We don't know. It's difficult to know. I mean, I'd lived there, as I said, for 5
Yeah.
years. And pre-October 7, I was less kind of vigilant about security things. So I would post photos of my family at home there. So I think it probably would have been pretty easy to find that as our former address. Did they know that I'd moved on and they were trying to send a message without getting too close to me? Did they think I lived there? I don't know. And
Are,
until we get to the bottom of it and investigate it, yeah.
and it is being investigated.
Of course, of
Yeah.
course. I
Yeah.
mean,
Are people living
yeah.
there now?
Yeah, so there's a Chinese Australian family that purchased the home from us and and they suffered the damage and they were obviously bewildered by the situation and they were very gracious and apologetic to us, and we were very apologetic back that they suffered this as a result of us. But it goes to show that anti-Semitism, it drags society down. And, and Australia has gone from being this kind of exemplar of harmony and peace and tolerance to being a place where things burn, where residential streets become infernos on a seemingly regular basis now.
It was such a full circle moment for you to buy that house. And I want you to talk about the connection with your grandfather.
Stephen, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal article. And, when I was speaking to the journalist and telling him the story that I've told you, he said, look, I want to probe deeper. Tell me why you bought the house. And I thought to myself, well, what sort of a question is that? Why does anyone buy a house? But then I realized there was a very specific reason why we bought that house and the way in which we bought it. So our family was expanding at that time. Our second daughter was just born. And we started to talk about, maybe we've outgrown our current home. We need to move. And the house is on a very prominent road in Sydney, where it's a beautiful place, where the road winds down to Bondi Beach. And on one side of it, you have the ocean. On the other side, you have views into Sydney Harbour, and it's glorious. And when my family migrated to Australia from the Soviet Union back in 1988, my grandfather, who was a bit too old to work and he couldn't speak English, the only thing he could do to kind of occupy himself was to drive this bus of Jewish elderly, mainly Holocaust survivors. He'd pick them up from their homes and take them to a Jewish social club and then back again. And he would get $5 a day, which was basically his lunch allowance, but he would keep it and bring it home to my grandmother as his wages. That's all he could earn. And sometimes he would pick me and my brother up and we'd join him on the bus and I'd chat to these people and listen to their stories. And we would drive up and down the same road because a lot of them lived either on it or the streets running off it. And I remember looking at him as he would look at this and behold the beauty of Sydney, Australia, the peace, the ocean air, the tranquility of it, the furthest place you could be from Soviet anti-Semitism imaginable and the killing fields of the Holocaust era and all these sorts of things. And to me, that road represented hope and success and achievement and a new start for our family. And I would jog along that road frequently, and then I saw a for sale sign on that house, and just like that, I don't think we saw any other homes. We bought that one, so it meant a lot more to me than merely a home and a family home. Like there was a deeper resonance and symbolism behind it. So I think seeing it doused in red paint and those slogans, written on cars in front of it when we had fled Soviet anti-Semitism, and now to see it follow us here, it was a disturbing thing. It was very upsetting.
Alex, what do your girls know? And what have they asked you?
They occasionally, especially my middle daughter, who's 8 years old, she asks me, are we safe? Is it okay? Are people going to come for us? My older daughter, who tends to take things in her stride a bit more, when everything was happening and the media was calling, we sent our daughters away to my mother-in-law to be kind of away from it all. But then when they came back in the evening, they had spoken to their friends and their school friends. They were all chattering about the fact that our home was targeted, and there was all this speculation. And so they were asking questions, are we safe in our home? Is it okay? Why did people try to do this? And there's no good answer to that question. I don't like to deceive them. I don't like to keep anything from them, but I need them to sleep at night as well.
Right. I'd like to talk about the media and the media's response in the Jew hatred and the anti-Israel activities that have been going on in Australia since October 7th, what we're talking about. Can you talk about the media's response? And I'd like you also to address particularly Erin Mullen from Sky News, because she has been very outspoken in support of Israel.
So the media was always kind of fractured in this country, but it's become far more pronounced. So there are certain outlets and publications that have done a phenomenal job in spotlighting what's happening to the Jewish community, what's happening to Australian society, and really making the story of anti-Semitism relatable to all Australians. And You have publications like our national broadsheet, our main national newspaper, which is called The Australian, which has been phenomenal. Sky News, you mentioned, has been unbelievable. The Daily Telegraph has been great. All the media in the country has covered this exhaustively, but some have done so in more constructive ways, others less so. And equally on their coverage of Israel and reporting on the conflict, there's clearly a schism in the media, as there is in the United States as well. Erin is someone who was on Sky News. She was a presenter there, and she had a very great show and a good profile. And I'd been on her show a number of times, and she became a real fighter for the Jewish cause, someone who showed great empathy to the Jewish people and understanding of what we're going through. She's the daughter of a retired, he was a colonel in the Australian Army, and he was a member of parliament. And I think he instilled a lot of her values and a lot of her fondness for the Jewish people and empathy towards us. And she's been great. So she's no longer with Sky, but Sky has been wall to wall fantastic in their coverage. It wasn't Erin alone. But Sky, they parted company for whatever ways, so parted ways for whatever reason. I'm not sure exactly. But Erin continues to advocate strongly for the Jewish people and for Israel. She's a wonderful person, and we're lucky to have her.
Right, indeed. I echo that, and I suggest that everybody follow her on social media. I mean, I certainly follow her on X, and I really appreciate her approach and her presentation of the facts and the story. I'm almost reluctant to ask you this question, Alex. How's that for a setup? Because I know that you have to deal with the government and with the police. But what grade would you give the government and the police in handling all this? And if you don't want to, that's totally okay. And I totally respect that, again, because you have to engage with them.
It's a very hard question. Not only am I probably unable to be as, I suppose, reductionist in terms of like giving a sheer grade, I can tell you exactly what I think about everything they've said and done. And I've done so publicly in this country many times. But in terms of giving a grade, it's very difficult because the federal government will point to certain achievements that they've put in place to deal with anti-Semitism. And a lot of those are accurate. So I mentioned the mass doxing of Jewish creatives. They then, following advocacy from my organization, passed laws which are modeled on laws that exist in Washington state that criminalize doxing, the malicious sharing of people's private information online. That's now a criminal offense. After the burning of the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne, they devoted tens of thousands of dollars to Jewish communal security, which is great. But in very many cases, their response has been very flat-footed. And rather than early on saying, we have a growing problem in this country and we're going to stamp it out and deal with it, which would have been an enlightened way to deal with it and an act of leadership, I feel like their stomach and their heart hasn't been in the fight. And each time they've taken action, it's only been because they've been dragged to do so because of events and media coverage and political pressure. That's my very, very honest assessment. I think they have done certain things to protect the community, but I can't say they've done it with a great zeal and desire to do this. That's not to say they want anti-Semitism or they tolerate anti-Semitism, but we haven't seen the sort of vigor you would expect from a federal government during a time of crisis, unprecedented crisis in this country. In terms of the police are a complex beast because you have state police forces and federal police. And as happens in the United States as well, there's jurisdictional issues and different task forces and ways of dealing with things. I think the intent is there, but the way the police have handled certain incidents has left a lot to be desired. So I mentioned the Opera House incident. The police chose to make no arrests in that instance. They saw what was unfolding before their eyes, the burning of flags, the chanting of racist slogans, and it was allowed to pass. I think they took the view that they don't want to antagonize it further. And from an operational point of view, let them do what they're doing and keep other citizens away. And that's the best way to deal with it. But maybe from a policing point of view, it is. But from a wider societal point of view, it isn't. Just also in the way that the police have announced in the last day or so, these revelations about the role of organized crime. They used the word hoax. They said that something was a hoax. The discovery of a caravan packed with explosives with notes identifying Jewish targets was a hoax. That then sparked a whole flurry of online activity about the Jews fabricating anti-Semitism, about how the whole anti-Semitic crisis in this country is a lie. And I think that the way that they handled it left a lot to be desired, and I think it's going to make the community less safe as a result. So I think there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of wonderful, police officers who just want to do their job and keep people safe. But I think there've been some very significant missteps along the way as well.
So, Alex, as we sort of begin to wind down the conversation, I just have a couple other bases I want to touch on. And one of them is just sort of for me to understand and articulate what you've shared in the conversation, that the vast majority of Australians, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the vast majority of Australians are peace loving. They just want to get on with their lives. They have no interest in any sort of foreign engagement. And again, they just want to live their lives. Yet, there is a small, very vocal group of people, and as you've said, that it's come to light that they possibly can be supported by foreign actors, that crime syndicates can be involved in this. It's a small group, yet it's insidious, and they are creating a lot of and wreaking a lot of havoc in the country, and that's what we need to watch and we need to control, because it can spread further like wildfire. Did I get the lay of the land there?
I think you really encapsulated it beautifully. I think that's exactly what we're dealing with. I think that it's true that the vast majority of Australians firstly have no involvement in what's happening and also in no way support what's happening. But as we've said, it doesn't require the majority. It
Yeah.
requires a determined, sinister minority and others to be silent or to be complicit or to be apathetic. And I think there's been too much of all of those things.
And so what role then does the Jewish community have, in the responsibility the Jewish community has to educate the rest of the population about what Judaism is all about, what about our heritage, the important contributions that Jews have made to Australia? I mean, what can the Jewish community really do then?
I think that we have a historic duty right now to fight for the Jewish community. And that means doing very many things because firstly, it means protecting the physical security of our community in this time of turmoil. And that means, again, working with the police and the government and getting the things that we need to keep the Jewish community safe. But then also, advocating for better education programs and public campaigns about anti-Semitism and a deeper understanding of who the Jewish people are, and engaging influencers across society to tell positive stories about the Jewish community and to fight and counter the lies and the disinformation that are just being pushed everywhere. There's so much to be done, and the moment of crisis is probably not the best time to do many of these things. Because at the moment we're just dealing with what's in front of us day by day, and the ground is shifting underneath us. It feels like things are shifting in so many ways, and things are so unpredictable and volatile, and they're only going to get more so. In the next few months, we're going to have a federal election in this country. And during the campaign, which will be called any day now, anti-Semitism and the government's response to it will be a key election issue: national security, societal harmony. So we have a duty right now to engage with the political class, to try to get the best outcomes for our community, but also to show Australians who we are and show them that we're not merely victims of terror and crime and hatred, but we're loyal, loving Australians. But just a final point on that. I mean, in my advocacy, I've been making that point a great deal about our origins in this country and our contributions to it. And I mentioned that I went to Poland immediately after the attack on my home for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And one thing that I left with from my time in Poland, which I hadn't really been aware of, was how deep the roots of the Jewish people were in that country. They'd lived there for 1,000
Yeah.
years. And they were cavalry heroes, and they were merchants, and they were architects that designed the cities, and they contributed so much. And yet when the tide turned, they were expunged and plundered and forgotten. And so one of the lessons I took from that is it doesn't matter how loyal we are to this country, doesn't matter how long we've been here. nothing ultimately protects us and saves us. So we need to be in that mindset and on that footing. We need to tell our story, but we need to be ready as well and vigilant and up for the fight. And I believe we are.
Listen, we're releasing this episode right before Purim, and so that's a cautionary tale. We just read Parashat Zachor this last Shabbat, which again, it's all about memory. And so again, we have to be vigilant and we have to be on guard. You know, as all of this erupted, not only in Australia, but listen, here on the streets of New York, all over the United States, all over the world, I was reminded of the Inquisitions and the expulsions and the you name it that the Jewish people have endured throughout the centuries and throughout the millennia. And of course, you've written extensively about this. So I personally, even though I haven't written about it, Alex, but I personally see this as just one of those watershed moments that is part of the Jewish experience and part of Jewish history. And we've read about it in history, but we've never lived it. And now we're living it. And I get very frustrated when I hear like Gen X, Gen Y, people that are very, very smart and, you know, influencers and writers and thinkers and so forth, thought leaders, etc. And they say, we never thought this was going to happen. How could this have happened? And I think to myself, really? I mean, don't you just look at history? And history repeats itself and repeats itself. And it's not that we're so enlightened now that history isn't going to repeat itself. And I'm just wondering if you can weigh in on all that.
I mean, everything you've said is so true and so accurate, Stephen. But I think ultimately, as human beings, we kind of operate rationally, and anti-Semitism is so irrational
Yeah.
in the way that it's conceived and expressed and manifests that it's difficult for us to think that it's going to happen. And you know, in my book on Zionism, the chapter on the Holocaust, I say something at the beginning about how, you know, it was entirely predictable because it had been shown to us in preview over and over again. And before the Holocaust, you had the pogroms, and you had Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and you had blood libels, and all of these things showed us how sinister individuals can manipulate the masses, sell them spook stories about Jews stealing and torturing and draining the blood of their children. And intelligent people will believe it and they will act on it in the most barbaric and human ways. We were shown that over and over again. And the Holocaust is merely a collection of those experiences. Again, tens of thousands of perpetrators carrying out the most abhorrent crimes that were done to us over and over again throughout our history. Nothing should have surprised us. And yet, the construction of 6 purpose built factories for human annihilation in the heart of Europe, operated by normal human beings, still shocked us. And we're still puzzled about how the hell did that happen? And even post the Holocaust, seeing that happen, I think we revert again to our inherent optimism and rationalism and say that was a deviation in human history and that can't happen again. But we know that that's just a nonsense. And we know that human beings don't learn the lessons of the past. We know, as Mark Twain says, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And what's happening now rhymes a great deal with everything that's happened to us for thousands of years. When October 7 happened, it was unique, but it rhymed with the Nazi killing squads that hunted Jews house to house. It rhymed with the pogroms, where you had this expulsion of frenzied joy and desire to murder and rape and maim and abduct and humiliate. And that's what we're living through. And I think the Jewish world awoke on October 7. We should never have been dormant, but I think we were. That this is our moment, this is our generation's struggle, and we have to rise to it. And we have a lot at stake. We have everything at stake, and a history and a legacy to preserve and fight for. And the one thing that gives me hope is that we are now unified, and we are standing here ready for the fight in a way that I don't think we've ever been before. And that gives me some degree of hope.
Yeah, and a lot of people have returned to their Judaism or have returned to a
Absolutely.
love of Israel. I shouldn't even say return to because some never had it to begin with, but uh, um, their Jewish soul has awoken.
It's true. And a lot of the differences that we would use to, define ourselves or separate ourselves from other Jews about progressive and conservative and liberal Zionist and conservative Zionist. I think we realized on October 7th, none of that matters at all. And there's no Israel in the diaspora. There's one Jewish people with Jews living in Israel and Jews living in New York and Sydney, Australia. And we're all responsible for each other and we're all in a common struggle. And that's it. And that's what it comes down to. And these aren't just kind of empty slogans or rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
This is something which I'm living and seeing in my city here in Sydney and throughout Australia. I'm having people stop me in the street all the time, talking about how they've lapsed in their Jewishness, how they were totally oblivious to things like Israel and anti-Semitism. And now they're here and they're present and they're awake and they're contributing to the community. And I think when all of this ends, I'm not sure how it's going to end, but I think we're going to emerge stronger for it.
So at the end of the day, Alex Ryvchin is optimistic. Is that a fair assessment?
Always. Absolutely, always.
Yeah.
Always. I have diminishing faith in wider humanity, but never have I been more optimistic and proud of the Jewish people and more certain of our survival and of our victory over whatever comes at us. Of that, I'm absolutely sure.
All right. On that positive note, we're going to leave it right there. Alex Ryvchin, we're going to have you back because, again, this is an unfolding story and we want you to share what it's all about and how it unfolds before too long. But we want to thank you so much. And we should share, actually, Alex, with our listeners that because I'm in New York City and you're in Sydney, we have a 15-hour time difference. And as we're winding down this episode, it's 11:07 p.m. here in New York City, which is way past my bedtime. But I have to say, that you are the only guest I think I would entertain staying up this late for, Alex, just so you know.
Thank you. I'm humbled. Thank you. And really, I've said this to you privately. I'm going to say it publicly now.
What?
I've done a billion interviews,
Mhm.
but you are always the most astute and the best prepared. And it's always just a sheer honor and a pleasure to speak to you, Stephen, truly.
Oh, listen, thank you. I so appreciate that. Really. Well, I have to tell you, you're wonderful to interview because, again, the subject matter is so interesting. And of course, you are also very well prepared and you know your facts. And I really appreciate that. So,
Thank you
really,
so much.
right back at you. And so, again, we're going
Thank
to
you.
have you back. So, stay right where you are. But for you, our dear listeners, we'll have info about Alex on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And please check out his books, Zionism, The Concise History, The Seven Deadly Myths, Anti-Semitism from the Time of Christ to Kanye West, and the Anti-Israel Agenda Inside the Political War on the Jewish State. You can pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. Go to Amazon. I can't recommend them enough. And also what I would suggest, and by the way, you know what happened, Alex? I didn't tell this to you, but after October 7th, I thought to myself, I want to share books that I've gotten a lot out of. And so I posted on all my social media handles a whole bunch of books, and I included these three books as books
Thank
that
you.
people should read because I think people that aren't familiar with the Jewish community in Israel need to learn and need to read. And these books really give a great primer to all of that. So once again, for you, our dear listeners, please pick up Alex's books and even give them to your friends that aren't Jewish in your community so that they can learn a little bit more about Judaism and Israel and the Jewish people. All right. Once again, jnf.org/IsraelCast for more about Alex. And of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. It's so easy. Simply search for IsraelCast. And don't forget to rate and review us because that helps with our ranking, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us and to hear from extraordinary people like Alex. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a homo shop to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, JD Krebs, and Ellie Kadrin. And our editor is the one and only Jay Rothman. The music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. And for more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello, I know Alex would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.